Welcome to Finding the Cause, our brand new podcast highlighting the efforts of Find the Cause Breast Cancer Foundation. I'm Caitlyn Mosher Ellis, Executive Director of Find the Cause Breast Cancer Foundation. And I have to say that one of the striking things when I started in this position was that 1 in 8 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer in their lifetime. And of them, 90% will have no family history of the disease. I'm one of those women. And a lot of conversations focus about breast cancer with early detection and treatment. And those are incredibly important. At our organization, we're asking a different question. What if we focused on preventing breast cancer before it happened in the first place? That's what this podcast is all about, looking upstream, exploring the science of causation, and bringing you conversations with the experts and passionate advocates who are working to better understand some of the reasons why breast cancer happens, not just how to respond to it. So today, I'm very excited to be joined by someone who is the very center of that work. Joining me today is Dr. David Sherr, who leads our consortium of scientists and plays a critical role in shaping the scientific direction of our work. Dr. Sherr, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me, Caitlyn.
To start, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a bit. Can you share your background and what led you into this field of research?
Sure. I got my PhD from Cornell University at New York Hospital in Manhattan, and did my postdoctoral work and then became faculty at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Pathology there, where I was also studying immunology. Around 1993 or so, I started looking at environmental chemicals and their role in generating cancers. So I was then recruited to the Boston University's School of Public Health and the Department of Environmental Health to look at some of the causes of cancers that can be prevented. What led me into this was exactly that I was learning that there are many ways we can prevent cancer from happening in the first place. That's what I was interested in, so that's why I'm connected to Find the Cause.
Great, thank you. So because it's literally in our name of the organization, one of the phrases that we use all the time, it sounds so simple, but it's actually a pretty significant shift in how people think about breast cancer. When we say find the cause, what does that mean from a scientific standpoint?
Well, it means trying to determine what has initiated the cancer process. A lot of the time, people think that it's just some genetic change that happens, it's just bad luck, but it turns out it's probably more than that. It's some exposure to environmental chemicals, and we're also interested in learning what were the initial signals of the process that commits cells to become cancers.
So what drew you specifically to the mission of Find the Cause Breast Cancer Foundation?
Well, really, it was just one question. Why? Why are people getting breast cancer and some other cancers as well? So according to the U.S. government's Surveillance Epidemiology and End Results Program, it's called the Sherr program, they keep track of frequency of cancers. And as you mentioned earlier, Caitlyn, around 1950, the odds of getting breast cancer were about 1 in 12. Now it's about 1 in 8. So there's been a rise in the incidence of breast cancer over a relatively short period of time. 50 to 70 years is not really a long time for these kinds of things to change that much. In 1950, there were about 55,000 cases of breast cancer in the U.S. Now it's 350,000 cases in the U.S. And the projection is that it will rise to about 460,000 within the next 20 years or so. That's kind of a scary statistic. It now costs about $1 billion out-of-pocket dollars for patients to be treated for breast cancer. And there's a particular red flag that's gone up in the last 5 to 10 years, which is that breast cancer is happening at an even higher or increased incidence in young women under 50, and those cancers tend to be more aggressive. So as the former director of the International Association for Research on Cancer once said, you can't treat your way out of this. It's just too much. It's too much of a burden on the healthcare system, too much of a burden on humans. So the only answer I can think of is prevention. And as I'll be able to explain, I suppose, prevention is totally possible. So why Find the Cause Breast Cancer Foundation in particular? Well, it's the only organization that's dedicated to breast cancer prevention, just the prevention part, not the therapy part. You know, as Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That holds true in this field as well. Only about 10% of the NIH budget is directed towards cancer prevention. That's just not enough given the size of the problem, and that's where Find the Cause Breast Cancer Foundation comes in. The foundation's made up of patients, family of patients, unfortunately, people who will get breast cancer in the near future, and amazingly motivated advocates. No one wants to get that phone call when you come home from what you think is a normal checkup, and you get the phone call that says you have breast cancer. The two questions that almost always come to mind are, am I going to survive this? And why? What happened? Even with successful treatment, the physical and emotional costs on people going through this process and on their families is just enormous. It turns life upside down. Now, I've experienced that firsthand in 1996. My wife came home from a routine checkup and said, we found these results, and I knew immediately that was cancer. She fought that for 2 years and 4 months, didn't survive it, left me with my kids of 11 and 9 years old. So that's a pretty good motivator to find out what happened. The particular cancer she had has been linked to environmental exposures. So I found Find the Cause, and the idea was join the fight to completely prevent this beast from ever getting out of its cage. So yeah, prevention.
And because it's literally in our name, one of the phrases that we use all the time is finding the cause. And, when I was diagnosed, it was the same thing. How did this happen? It's not as if you touched something that gave you cancer. It's a lot longer progression than that. And so what does it mean from a scientific standpoint, that significant shift of looking upstream to finding the cause?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you Cancer 101 in 2 seconds. So cancers exhibit three main characteristics. One is that they grow too fast. Second thing is they forget how to die. They virtually become immortal. And the third thing is they have an identity crisis. They can't remember where they're supposed to be, so they metastasize to different places. What finding a cause means and looking upstream is, what are the molecular changes that presage these things happening? What happens in the genes? What happens in signaling pathways that tell you that things are on the wrong track, that it's going to get bad fast? So we're looking for those upstream indicators of something going bad. What we've learned is that there's a myriad of very common environmental chemicals that kick that machine into action. Once we learn what those changes are, we can identify when someone is now at risk. And this is before you see anything, any kind of a lesion, ahead of when any kind of imaging could pick it up. We would see molecular changes, and it would give us the opportunity to intercept the cancer before it ever happens. So that's really what it really means from a scientific perspective to try to prevent cancer and find the cause.
And that's very helpful, I think. And, historically, causation and the root causes haven't gotten that much attention. As you were talking earlier, as Find the Cause being one of the only organizations that is in the business of prevention, we all agree that treatment and cure is very important. But why do you think that looking at the root causes of cancer hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves?
Yeah, so I can put it perhaps a little crudely but accurately. It's not as sexy as being able to say, here's a drug, I just saved your life. That's something that's very tangible and people can see and appreciate, and we all love it, especially the new therapies that are out there now. When you're doing prevention, it's a statistical benefit. You're saving some people, you don't know who they are, but you're saving them from undergoing this horrible experience. So even if, you save 10% of the people, that's 35,000 women who don't have to go through the process that they've just talked about. That's if you just do 10% better at preventing cancer. So I think that's probably the reason why it hasn't got so much attention. It's just hard to picture that the people you save are invisible. You don't know who they are. But I would add, though, that the education program, the outreach program at Find the Cause probably has already saved lives. In other words, teaching people how they can take control and avoid exposure to these chemicals, which you can do by looking at the Find the Cause website. I'm quite sure it's already saved people. We don't know who they are, and that's okay with me, as long as we save people.
Well, and I think that focusing on the cause really reframes the conversation around breast cancer and cancers in general. And it's a difference between reacting to a disease and stopping it before it starts. So let's make this a bit more tangible for listeners. So what are some of the key factors that research is showing that could contribute to breast cancer risk?
Yeah. So most everybody will say, well, we know about the BRCA1 gene and the BRCA2 genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2. But those genes and other things that are inheritable in families only account for, at most, 10% of all these breast cancers. Most of the breast cancers happen without a family history, as you explained. There have been recent studies that have calculated that about, 80 to 85% of all cancers are caused by extrinsic factors, things outside of just plain bad luck, your genes just messed up. So that means that 80% potentially is preventable. Now, when you hear that, you think, well, that's crazy. You mean prevent 80% of cancers? That's possible. That's not nuts. That's not pie in the sky stuff. So what are some of these extrinsic factors? Well, certainly some of them are these environmental chemicals. There are many epidemiologic studies that show that people who get breast cancer are disproportionately exposed to certain chemicals. And in a bit, I'll explain why it's sometimes difficult to figure out which chemicals those are. And we and lots of other people have shown that if you take a variety of very common environmental products or chemicals, and you put them in various model systems, in a mouse, in a tissue culture system, something like that, you get changes that are characteristic of cells that are about to become full-blown cancers. And in some case, you actually get them to go full transformation to a malignancy in an animal or in a tissue culture. So in this case, you find associations among populations. You find the same thing happening in the model systems. You can start to say that this environmental chemical does this, this, and this. It's sort of, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So we're looking at environmental chemicals and how they can affect cell function. And just one last point, even when someone has a BRCA1 mutation, it doesn't mean that there weren't extrinsic factors that contribute. In fact, it's very likely that even with BRCA1, that's not sufficient to induce a cancer, that you still need to have some kind of exposure to environmental chemical, for example, to trip the whole event.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. And, we talk a lot about exposures, and I think there's an awareness now more about what people are putting on their bodies, what people are using for lawn care, what people are drinking out of for an everyday vessel. Can you just talk a little bit about what those exposures do to a body over time?
Oh, yeah.
As we talked about before, it's not as if you just touch cancer and you suddenly get it, but what is that scenario?
Yeah, so let me just put some things in perspective. If you ask somebody how many chemicals do you think there are out there, they'll say, I don't know, I'll exaggerate, 100, 200, 500. Well, as of this morning, the EPA's Toxic Substance Control Act has registered 86,741 chemicals in use out there. 86,741 chemicals. Here in the United States, those chemicals basically have civil rights. We assume they're innocent until proven guilty, and proving them guilty, in other words, proving they generate cancers, can take 10 years. So it takes a long time to do that. In the European Union, which has banned far more chemicals than the United States have, they go by the precautionary principle, which is prove that it's safe to us before we can put it into use. Now, of those 86,741 chemicals, only a few hundred have actually been tested rigorously to find if they're carcinogenic, if they can induce cancers. We don't know about the rest, and almost nobody understands what happens when you have mixtures of these chemicals. So if I took your blood, or pretty much anyone listening or watching this podcast, if I took their blood, I would find dozens and dozens of environmental chemicals in there. Nobody knows how those things can interact. Now, how do these chemicals, how do the exposures work on the body over time? Well, cancer pretty much results from an accumulation of cellular changes. And there's basically two kinds of these cellular changes. One is genes become mutated and they start doing bananas things. That's the easiest way to explain what goes on in a cancer, and it's not uncommon. And many of these environmental chemicals can generate those types of mutations. But the second thing that can happen that's equally important is that the chemicals can mimic some kind of stimulant within cells that normally does something normal, like helps the cell grow a few times. But now the environmental chemicals have essentially bastardized that signaling process so that it's always turned on. So you think about, the analogy is like a doorbell. If someone comes to the door and rings your bell once, you come out and you know somebody's there. And that's like a cell getting, a signal from a hormone, for example. But in this case, it just keeps ringing and ringing and ringing, and that will drive you crazy. And that's essentially what happens within those cells. So it's mutations, and then it's permanent activation of certain signaling pathways. Now, the second hit here is that many of the same chemicals that cause cells to become cancers also suppress the immune system. That's a big deal. Virtually everybody over 40 or 50 years old has already had cancer, whether they know it or not. And when you don't know that you had it, it's because your immune system has killed it. That's called immune surveillance. So there's this kind of double whammy where many of these environmental carcinogens not only make the cells go crazy, but they also suppress the one system that's flexible enough to catch up to cancers as they begin to develop. So part of our work is to understand how these things happen and to boost the immune response to cancers as much as we can. And I'll point out that whatever we learn here about chemical suppressing immune systems in breast cancer is applicable to virtually every other kind of cancer.
And I think that's an important point too, is that not only are we looking at the exposures and the things that we use every single day, but the fact that this work that's being done by the Find the Cause Research Consortium is applicable and shareable globally. And I think that definitely sets the level for everybody, that this work is not just being done in a vacuum here, but it's being shared. So Find the Cause Breast Cancer Foundation really has two major pillars. One, as you referred to, as our education program and how we can avoid toxicants and carcinogens in our everyday life. And stay tuned, because that will be a podcast all into itself. And the other part of it is the research that you're talking about. And this is where donor dollars really make such an impact. So as the lead of the Find the Cause Consortium, can you just give a brief sneak peek into what the consortium looks like? And then we are delighted to go into this in further detail in an upcoming episode.
Sure. Yeah. So the consortium is made up of a select group of 7 scientists now from Boston University, Harvard, Tufts University, and City of Hope in Los Angeles. And basically what it is a group of pretty well-known scientists working together in complementing areas to figure out exactly what's causing these cancers, how they happen, how we can detect them way before you get to this lesion, and then how to intercept them at some point earlier on so no one has to go through that experience of what's this chemo going to be like.
Great. So with what you're talking about, that's a little bit of both primary and secondary prevention. Can you talk a little bit about both those concepts?
Yeah, exactly. So we think of this, the research group is standing on 3 pillars. So there's primary prevention. Primary prevention is identifying who the bad guys out there, and we have ways we think of doing this more quickly than it's been done before. 2, secondary prevention is identifying those markers I was talking about that presage the cancers, so that we know something's about to happen before it really becomes anything. And then the third thing is, okay, what are you going to do about it? Aside from telling people not to be exposed to a certain chemical, we're devising ways to go in either behavioral changes or non-toxic compounds that we use to intercept the cancer before it becomes even a precancer.
Well, Dr. Sherr, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I, for one, am so grateful for the work that you're doing and for what the direction that you've led the consortium thus far, and I know you'll continue to lead in the future. And thank you for sharing your insights on the work that's being done. This is a huge scope of information, and I can't wait for our next episode where we get to dive into the work of the individual researchers, how they collaborate together, and where we see the future of breast cancer prevention going. So if I were to ask you for one key takeaway today for our listeners, what would you tell them?
One key takeaway, I would say that the idea of preventing 70 to 80% of all breast cancers is absolutely doable. It's not pie in the sky. It's not hopeless. People can get some control. They can take actions. And again, I'd refer them back to the Find the Cause website. In the end, it's really up to all of us to make prevention happen, and it's doable. We just need to do it. Let's do it.
Well, Dr. Sherr, as director of the Find the Cause Research Consortium, we're so lucky to have you with us today and can't wait to visit this again in part 2. And to everyone watching us on YouTube and listening to this audio podcast platform, thank you for joining us today. And if you'd like to learn more about the work that we're doing or how to get involved, you can visit us at findthecausebcf.org. Follow us on Facebook, watch for us on Instagram. Definitely link in with us. And if you know somebody who might benefit from the information that we just shared with you today, please have them subscribe to our channel. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to the second part of this podcast where we dive into the individual work of each of the Research Consortium members and how they collaborate together. And after that, stay tuned because we have a whole lineup of guests that are going to be joining us right here on Finding the Cause. So thanks so much and have a great day.